of really any kind of work that we're going to do with this population, thinking about what is the role of an anti-deficit perspective, what is the role of masculinity, what is the role of being equity-minded, and what is the role of embedding love. So just like what we would consider to be some basic concepts, what does that look like when we're talking about working with this population? So today we'll have two guest speakers. They include Shaun Harper, who is the Clifford and Betty Allen Chair in Urban Leadership at the University of Southern California, USC, and Frank Harris III, who is a professor of post-secondary education here at San Diego State University, and my close colleague as well. Frank and I co-direct the Community College Equity Assessment Lab here at San Diego State, and we partner with community colleges across the country to examine factors that influence the success of underserved students, with a particular focus on men who have been historically underserved in our community colleges, those who are Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander men. And so they'll both be here. Frank will be here at about 5 o'clock and Shaun will be here at 7 o'clock. So for those of you who are on the live broadcast, we'll go from 4:30 to 6, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll actually start back up with Shaun at 7. If you are watching this live and you're worried about missing out on Shaun, just know that we're recording everything, and so you'll be able to go back and listen to that at any point. So I'd also like to again thank our sponsor, one of our sponsors or supporters, Our Scholarship Matters. Our Scholarship Matters provides apparel that really looks at advancing social justice. Now, I put this up because I think it's important to mention that we do not receive any proceeds from them, but what they did is provide us with thousands of dollars worth of free material and apparel that we use to help advertise this course. So I'm wearing one of their shirts tonight. I know that there's others in the room who are. Please, check out their website. They, went out of their way to support us, and so we want to support them. I'd also like to, again, remind those who are participating that we have a number of partner organizations who are helping to support the delivery of this course. They include the Education Trust West, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, Moms of Black Boys United, which I'll talk about here in a moment, San Diego State University Instructional Technology Services, Our Scholarship Matters, and the Center for Organizational Responsibility and Advancement, CORA, which the part of our lecture tonight will include information that's derived from them. So what I wanted to start with today is really talking about love. So we talked last time when I read the introduction to the course in terms of our focus on racial justice and linking issues that we see in policing with the schooling of Black boys and men. So we talked a lot about that. And then I also read two quotes, which I'm going to revisit here. So the first one is from Dr. Asa Hilliard. And it says, "I've never encountered any children in any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings. And the second thing you do is love them." I also said, pulling from my own background in faith, we are taught to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so I said, love your neighbor as yourself and love their children as your children. Teach them with love, discipline them with love, build personal relationships with love as if they were your own. And so what I want to talk about is what does that look like to have a loving relationship with the children and adults that you work with. And so what I want to do is kind of make this translation between viewing them as our own. What does that mean to view them as our own? And talk about what does that look like in terms of actual practice. So I'm going to provide you with 10 points in terms of what I think that can look like from an educational perspective, and begin by talking about my own experience with my own children. So I'm blessed to have 3 wonderful children, a boy and 2 girls. And when my wife was pregnant with them, there was this incredible anticipation of when they would come. I was excited trying to figure out, okay, how do I prepare for this? How do I get ready to help bring these children into the world? And so, a million things are running through your mind, but there's this excitement about them being in your presence and the ability to be able to hold this new baby and even to be able to be proud to show this baby to others. Then as, after the child was born and we began to do those things, I began to then study them, just like because I was so interested in learning about them. So with my son, what made him laugh? What made him cry? When were the times that he slept? When were the times that he didn't sleep? And then as he began to get older, then looking and studying him, looking at other things like, when did he start to walk? What were the things that led to that? And crawling before that, of course, and talking. What was the first words that came out of his mouth? So I began to then learn about him with incredible interest. And I think that when we engage the students that we have, that we can take those same kind of perspectives and then bring that into the learning experience with them. So the excitement of arrival, as a student enters into your class, being truly excited that they are there and letting them be able to see that, hey, I'm happy that you are here today, that your presence is meaningful to me, and thinking about that transition from them coming from outside of the classroom to inside the classroom, how do we then convey that kind of message and that kind of relationship? Secondly, then learning about them with interest, taking the time to learn about them. What are their interests? What are the things that they like to do? What are the things that they don't like to do? Learning about their families, their communities, their cultures, everything that you can learn about them. Why? Because we actually are truly interested in learning what is it that makes this person this person. And then, of course, from an educational perspective, we can then take that information, leverage those assets to then help support the learning experience for that student. For our children, we typically want the best for them. We want the greatest opportunities for them to have the greatest life experience that they can. And so what do? We advocate for them to make sure that happens. If there is a program that we can put them in that's going to give them a better opportunity, we're going to advocate for them to get into that. If we see that someone isn't treating them well, we're going to advocate for them to be treated well, right? Because we have this true desire to see them do better. And then as part of that, we also then worry about them. I worry constantly about my own children. I worry that they will struggle. I worry that they won't be able to have all the opportunities that should be afforded to them. I worry particularly with my son, what does it mean for him to grow up in this world as a black man? And how will he be engaged in school settings? How will he be engaged by law enforcement? So I worry about him. And so I think that we can also take those same two concepts to be advocates for the individuals that we're working with, right? To let them know that we are there to support them. And not just to think it, but to verbally communicate that to them. And to be so invested in their success that we worry about them. They're on our minds in that way where we're thinking about, okay, what do we need to do to make sure that they don't step into that pitfall? How can we help them here, right? That they're constantly on our minds. To discipline them with love, right? So if you think about your child, right? Sometimes your child will do things that they shouldn't do. My kids do things that they shouldn't do all the time. And as a parent, right, what I try to do is to discipline them in a way where I'm trying to then teach them to make them better, to build them up, as opposed to necessarily punishing them to destroy them and bring them down. And so I think when we think about the kind of ways that we engage our black boys and our black men in a classroom setting, in some ways it should be no different, right? So sometimes we need to step in and say, hey, you're not doing something right. That's part of loving somebody, is giving them the honest feedback. But doing it from the standpoint that we're not trying to destroy them or bring them down, but we're doing it from a place where we care about them and we want to help use that as a learning experience to elevate them and their opportunities. With my kids, I boast about them. If you've ever heard me speak, at least sometime in every speech, I'm probably mentioning one, if not all three of them. Why? Because I'm extremely proud of them. With the students that we work with, in many ways, we should be doing the same thing, talking about them positively. And I think that's even more important when we're talking about black boys and black men. Why is that? Because the narrative of this population is what? That they're lazy, that they don't care, they're not really here for school. If they're in college, they're only really here for the financial aid. So there's this deficit perspective that rings true for this population, right? This is what people truly believe about them, but it's erroneous. And so it's even more important than as educators for us to present a counter narrative to the dominant narrative about these students. And we're going to talk more about what that looks like, because the class has a challenge for you all, which I'll talk about in a moment. Time investment. I am an extremely busy person, but you know what? What I view as important is the time that I have with my kids. And so whatever I have to do to make time to be able to engage with them, to take them out, to do fun things, to give them incredible experiences, loving someone means really setting aside that personal time to build a personal relationship with them. You can't just, go in front of the class, teach them and say that, yeah, these are people I care about. That's not enough. It takes a personal relationship. And in reality, most personal relationships are not built in the classroom, they're built outside the classroom, where you can have an informal interaction with a student, talk with them about what their interests are, what their likes are, again, learning about them, but really showing that you really want to engage with them. Another concept is called what we call shared investment. So shared investment is basically a manifestation of authentic care. So, and this is what it looks like, that when a student does well, when they succeed, when they get that good grade, when they transfer on to that institution that they want to go on to, whatever that measure of success should be, that we are so personally invested in them and their success that they know that we will feel like we've succeeded as well. And on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they don't do well, if something doesn't go right, that we are going to then personally feel like we didn't do well either, right? So it's not just that they have their own experience and we have our own experience and we're rooting for them. No, that our destinies, our livelihoods, our cares are interconnected. So it's that shared investment. And lastly, that we would guard them, right? With our kids, what do? We protect them against those who would want to bring them down, who would want to see them not do well. It should be no different with our students, right? We should want to guard them from those who might want to bring them down. And so let me give an example of what we see in terms of how that can look in a college setting. So let's say that I am a faculty member and I'm teaching a student and the student's in my class and he's not doing as well as he should. And I know by just having a conversation with him, you know what, he probably needs to go to financial aid because it looks like he might need an emergency loan, and he probably needs to go to tutoring services. But because my goal is to guard him, I'm not just going to say go to those services and they're going to give you what you need. I recognize that there's certain people on my campus who are going to be invested in him, who are going to want to support him, and are going to treat him the same way that I do. And I also realize that there's some people who aren't going to connect with him in the same way and may even not want to have those interactions with him. So what do? I pick up the phone and I call those people and I say to the people who I know will go out of their way for this student, I say, hey, I'm sending over whatever the student's name is to you right now. Will you be there to receive them? So that that student knows that there's someone who's there who's waiting on them. Even better, if I can go and walk that student over there and link them with somebody who I know is going to support them. So what is that all about? It's about guarding them and providing them with the best opportunities by linking them with people who we know are going to be truly invested in their success. So these are just some ways I think that as educators we can bring love into the educational context and help to express that as part of the work that we do. As part of this course, we ask the students who are here in the classroom to help identify some assignments for those who are the public learners in the course. And so each week we'll talk about a simple assignment that we have for you. They're very simple. They're straightforward. They're things that you can do that typically take 10 minutes or less of your time. But we feel like if there's this many people who are watching at this many sites across the country, that 10 minutes of your time equals a lot of time that's being put in by a lot of people. And so the first challenge or assignment that we have for you is what we're calling the Affirming Black Minds Challenge. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask each of you to create a 1 minute or less video of yourselves. And in that video, what we want you to do is to start out with a statement, Black minds matter because, and then say whatever you want to say that comes after that. So you might be asking yourself, why would we have this be an assignment as for the public learners in this course? Why is this important? Well, it goes back to why we want to boast about the students that we're working with to create a counter narrative. And that's again because the dominant perceptions of Black boys and Black men in society are perceptions that are negative. Perceptions that view them as having a lack of intelligence. perceptions that view them as being criminals, as coming from cultures that are lowly, as having no worth in our society except for being athletes or entertainers. So why do we want to do this? Because we want to shed and to portray a different type of view of this population, an asset-based view where we're talking about why they do matter, why they are important, what they do bring to the table, and talking about that in a way that then helps bring that to other people who may not be part of this course. So we have a short video for you of the guest speakers from this class. And what we asked each of them to do is say, hey, for just a few moments, can you talk about why Black minds matter? And so we're going to play that for you, and we're hoping that you will engage this challenge and that you will put together a short video of yourself doing the same thing. And when you do, we ask that you use the hashtag that we're using for this course, Black Minds Matter. And what you can do is you can use that hashtag, and you can feel free to tag us if you want to. If not, please use the hashtag so that people can see that this is important and that we do need to elevate and extol the value, morality, and dignity of Black minds.
Black minds matter because we built the first civilization.
Black minds matter because Black people have always made a contribution to American society.
Black minds matter because children need to know that they are loved in a society that might not communicate that to them.
Black minds matter because our younger generation are looking and depend on strong, intelligent Black minds.
Black minds matter because Black people are among the most talented and gifted intellectual thinkers on earth, and we need the proper equity in our institutions in order to cultivate that talent for the betterment of our society.
Black minds matter because thought begins in the mind. Whatever you conceive, you can achieve.
Black minds matter because genius lives within.
Black minds matter because oftentimes they're not given the space or recognition to prove that they matter. So it's important to embrace the fact that Black minds do matter. And there are Black people and brown people out there doing incredible things that have incredible minds that have and continue to make a powerful and important contribution to this country.
Black minds matter. Black minds matter because the onus is upon us that each one reach one and teach one. And we know that our fates are all inextricably linked one to another.
Black Minds Matter is an affirmative statement that our minds do indeed matter. Join us beginning October 23rd as we seek to raise the national consciousness about issues facing Black boys and men in education.
So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to give just a short mini lecture on implicit bias, because I think that if we're going to talk about what are some foundational concepts that we know influence the success of this population, this is certainly one that's very important. So and I should note that myself and Dr. Harris do a lot of work in schools and colleges doing training on implicit bias. And so what we've done here is just taken a few of the slides that we have that talk about this topic. This is a very mini lecture in comparison to the work that we do when we go someplace. So if you're feeling like after the end of this, say, hey, I wish I wanted more, it's because this is really just meant to give some basic concepts that are important. So what you see here on the slide before you is data that we have from our instrument that we collect data from. It's called the Community College Success Measure. It's a survey tool that we use that's distributed in randomly selected course sections with partner colleges across the country. We've used this survey now with over 100 community colleges across the nation. So it's a large sample of data that helps us to understand what are the factors that influence success for historically underserved students. And so as part of it, we ask questions around what's called racial preference. So racial preference is a concept that looks at to what extent do students believe that educators prioritize students of other racial ethnic groups in a very subtle way. To what extent do they give them preference? We used to actually measure this using stereotypes and just asking to what extent do you believe they have stereotypes about certain groups, and we'd find differences. But we thought it might be better to measure using more subtle ways, and it's actually helped to illuminate some of the challenges that we see. So on your slide, you'll see that we say, and one of the questions that we ask is, to what extent do you believe that your faculty members appreciate you, And to what extent do you believe that they are interested in you in comparison to men from other racial, ethnic groups? And so what you see on this slide is the level of disagreement with this statement. So larger bars would indicate someone who disagrees with the statement that faculty members appreciate them or that faculty members are interested in them. And what you'll see when you look at this data is that there's some pretty big differences across groups in terms of how they feel that they are perceived by educators. So for example, you can see that Black men were 140% more likely to perceive that faculty members do not appreciate them and 80% more likely to perceive that faculty members were not interested in them in comparison to white men who are in the same sample. You can also then see differences across other groups. For example, a high percentage of our Asian students in the sample reported this as well. You should note that a lot of the colleges that we partner with have high populations of Southeast Asian students, so Hmong, Cambodian, Laotian, Vietnamese. So that's likely represented in that sample. And you'll also see the same thing with multi-ethnic students. In this particular sample, we didn't see that with Latino students, but we do tend to see that as a pattern as well, particularly if you start disaggregating by ethnic identity within Latino. The next slide here talks about a concept that we call welcomeness to engage. If you look at the general literature on student success, there are three core concepts that are oftentimes viewed as being extremely important to our understanding of students. So one concept is called engagement. One concept is called involvement. And the other is called integration. And they are distinct in terms of what they're meaning, but in general, the research literature on these concepts basically assumes that the more a student becomes engaged, becomes involved, becomes integrated into a college setting, the better and more likely they are to succeed. So the more they become engaged academically, the more they become engaged socially, the better they are to do on that campus. And in reality, that we do know that's true. We do know that to an extent that a student who is using resources on campus, meeting with their faculty, part of organizations, who's doing all those things is typically the student who's going to be more successful. But from the work that we do, we're also aware of the fact that if we're talking about Black men and other men of color, we can't make an assumption that they feel like they have access to be able to do these same things that other students feel like they can. And so what we did is we have basically, in critique of much of that literature base, said that what we should be looking at as part of this is to what extent do students feel like they are welcome to engage. Welcome to ask questions in class, respond to questions in class, participate in group discussions. Welcome to, when they see a faculty member outside of class, to walk up to them, to have interactions with them, to talk with them about what they're doing. To what extent do they actually feel welcome to even engage? And we think that, especially based upon the data that we see, that some of the differences we see in terms of engagement outcomes is oftentimes a function of simply whether or not they believe that their engagement is both invited and desired. And so what you can see on this slide is looking at what we call our outside of class welcomeness. To what extent do students feel like they are welcome outside of the classroom to be able to say hello to faculty members, to talk with them about academic matters and do those things. And as you can see here on this data, there was a higher level of disagreement, same kind of pattern that you saw in the previous slides, for our Black students in comparison to white students, for our Latino students, and for our multi-ethnic students in the sample. On the left one and the one on the right side in terms of talking about academic matters, everyone was higher than the white population in this, right? So I think this is important because of two reasons. One, we can talk about engagement, we can talk about involvement, we can talk about integration, and they're great concepts. But if we don't take a step back and actually ask ourselves, well, does everyone feel like they actually have access to be able to do those things, then we're missing a key point of a student's experience. The second reason why it's important is because I believe that this data helps to illuminate what we refer to as implicit bias. That there are biases that students are experiencing in that environment that are leading to differential experiences. That implicit bias is a function of whether or not I will feel welcome to engage, and then whether or not I then will, of course, ultimately engage. So I have a couple quotes here that I want to read to you, and these are based upon some of the qualitative data that we've done in terms of collecting data with students with my work with Dr. Harris. So here's the first one. Black and Latino students are still often the only student from their group in class. And this is a quote from a student. And so you're in class feeling like, wow, the professor's probably going to be biased or single me out or whatever. I'm always thinking about that. And see, here's the thing that we've learned in the work that we've done is not having to think about race. In fact, it's not even the work we've done. A large body of work talks about this. Not having to think about race is a luxury that our students of color don't have. They constantly have to think about this and these dynamics because it influences their ability to be able to be successful. Here's another quote. Teachers and students, people on campus, they unconsciously make assumptions without thinking. They see you and assume that because you're a black male, they know all these things about you that might not even be right. So let's talk about what this is. This is a function of what we refer to, we believe, as implicit bias. And I'm going to read you two different definitions and one description and then talk about what are some key points that come out of this. So with the first definition, here's what we see. Implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control. So it's not purposeful necessarily. Can be either positive or negative. Everyone is susceptible. This comes from the Kirwan Institute. Here's another one. Implicit bias is characterized by the introspectively unidentified or incorrectly identified traces of past experience. That's going to be important because I'm going to bring that in later. That mediate attributions of qualities to members of social categories. And then lastly, this is just a description. The science of implicit cognition suggests that actors do not always have conscious internal control over the processes of social perception, impression formation, and judgment that motivate their actions. So what are some key points that we see that come across in these definitions? One, implicit bias refers to attitudes and attributions that we place on other groups, right? They are often unidentified, meaning that we're not necessarily thinking about these things because it's implicit, it's unconscious, right? It's not something that's at the forefront of our mind. We've just been taught by past experience to see groups certain ways, and then we basically enact that as part of what we do. And of course, then the outgrowth of that is then manifested through our actions. Our actions that microaggress students. Our actions that make a student feel maybe unwelcome to engage. These are the outgrowths of this bias. And so what we do know from the research literature is that there are two different generally types of thinking that individuals have. System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is that unconscious reasoning. It's responding to something unconsciously based upon, again, really you pull typically from your past experience. So it takes low effort because it's unconscious and it's automatic. It's not even something that you necessarily think about, you just do it. And that's oftentimes what we find in terms of the work that we do with microaggressions. If somebody microaggresses somebody, someone might call them out on it and they're like, what are you talking about? I didn't say that. That's not what I mean, because they didn't even realize where it came from because it was implicit. System 2 thinking is that conscious reasoning. So it's controlled effort. It's very high effort in terms of what you're doing. You're thinking intentionally about every word that comes out of your mouth. It's that high level of functioning. And what we know is that when you do that, you're probably less likely to engage your implicit associations about certain groups than when you're doing something unconsciously. So then you might ask yourself, okay, so if I'm more likely to engage implicit associations that might microaggress students or make them feel unwelcome to engage, when is that more likely to occur? Well, and if we know if it's through System 1 thinking, then, well, when am I more likely to activate that type of thinking? And here's when that occurs. In situations where information is ambiguous or incomplete. A real good example of this when we talk about men of color is behavior. We can construe behavior in many different ways based upon what we see. To us, one student who is animated is viewed by another person as that student is aggressive. For one student that we see on their computer who we think one person might assume that they're studying, Another person might assume that they're on social media and not paying attention, right? So it's where information is incomplete or ambiguous. Second, when circumstances are where time is constrained, where I don't have a lot of time to basically make decisions about what's going to take place, it's just happening, right? And as a result, I'm responding, right? For example, class has just ended. I mentioned this as an example last week. Class has just ended and now all these students are walking up to me and I'm trying to have quick engagements with each one, and then I accidentally microaggress somebody. Why? Because I'm not as being conscious about the things that I'm doing, I'm responding. And lastly, when our cognitive control is compromised, when we experience stress, when we experience insufficient sleep, when our time is just generally like we have just too much on our plate, right? Now it's funny because as an educator, when I see this, ambiguous or incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress or insufficient sleep, I look at that, I'm like, well, that's just my life. How many would agree with that statement? Most, right? That's our lives, particularly if we work in social settings. So we then, of course, then shouldn't be surprised that we're likely to see these implicit associations take place in our classrooms and in the interactions that our men of color have. I'm going to go further. We then, of course, also shouldn't be surprised when we see these interactions take place with police officers. How many times or when they engage somebody is there incomplete or ambiguous information? How many times when they engage somebody is time constrained and they're stressed and having insufficient sleep? So, of course, we see what we see as a pattern. But that doesn't have to be, because that is the condition, it doesn't have to be how things end. Because remember what I said at the beginning of the class, and I said I'd say it throughout this class, being biased doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. Choosing to do nothing about it, that is what's bad. So we all have biases. We all microaggress people. We all communicate things that we wouldn't like to communicate. Let's go a little bit further. So remember it said earlier in that definition that it's pulling from past experience. So we might ask ourselves then, okay, so what does that mean? And this brings us to a concept that we call the primacy effect. The primacy effect refers to the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. So I am blessed to work with Dr. Harris, who's here in advance of being able to have a conversation with him about the work that he does. And I've learned from him, based upon his background in speech, that when you have an argument, right, and someone makes the first argument, the person who makes that argument first is the person who has a stronger argument, because everything that comes after that is a counter argument. How many times, for example, have you watched the nightly news and you'll see like a panel and they're getting ready, and let's say that I am a person who's there who's leading the panel, and then I've got commentators, and I turn to the first person and I'm going to allow them to speak, and then I'm going to allow this person to speak, and this person over here, they've got all the notes down, they know exactly what they're going to say, they prepared themselves, they're ready, they know the points that they want to drive home, and then this person over here says something just totally out of left field. And some salacious statement, right? And now they're like, okay, now they're totally off script. And what are they doing? They're then basically responding to what that person said. So now everything that they say now is now a counter argument to the main argument that's been made. We talk about this in terms of a society as master narratives and counter narratives, right? A master narrative is the negative ways that we oftentimes view black boys and men. A counter narrative is what we've challenged people to do with these Affirming Black Minds videos. So in an argument standpoint, this is true, but it's also true in terms of a socialization standpoint. If you think about the earliest experiences that you have in seeing or engaging black boys and men, those probably influence the ways that you see them now, right? Because those are formative experiences. So here's an example of how this plays out. There was a study that talked about and looked at verbal and nonverbal cues. And what it was looking at is essentially providing children with videos, and they would see videos of how an educator would treat a certain child. And then what we would see is that essentially how those children saw that educators treated those children, whether it was positively or negatively, they then end up having the same kind of associations that the educators did. And here's the thing, in this study, it didn't focus on what was said, but on what they did. What does that mean? That the nonverbal behavior that is modeled early on, mostly unconsciously, is then replicated by those students. So talking about this isn't just important for the student who experiences it, but for the other students who watch it unfold, because they're going to begin to have the same types of associations and thinking about the students. And so the conclusion of their study was this: young children can catch bias from an infected atmosphere. That is, by observing nonverbal bias exhibited by other people around them. What is more, preschool children, which is where this study was a preschool study, generalize this bias to other individuals. Thus, exposure to nonverbal bias could be a mechanism for the spread of social bias throughout the world in the hearts and minds of children and adults. And so what we're going to do is we're going to engage in an exercise, and if you're in the class, I'm going to put up a link for you to be able to do this as well. And what I want you to do is just to think about to yourselves, what are some of the associations that you have when you think about your earliest experiences in either interacting with or seeing black boys and men? And so we're looking at thinking about this in different ways. What are some formative things that if I think back to when I was young, this is what comes to mind as it relates to what you might have seen in the media, or nonverbal behaviors from others, or attitudes of friends, or attitudes of family members. Everyone has a crazy uncle, right, who says things that they shouldn't say. Everybody's got one, right? So think about what are some things that you remember. And so what we want to do is we're going to go over to an application that's called Poll Everywhere, and we're going to give you an opportunity to go ahead and start to share what you think about that. Kron, can you pull that up? Always in groups, needing help, media, football players. Keep on bringing them through. I'm going to erase this now. Little Black Sambo, characters on TV, football players, Static Shock, Michael Jackson and the Jackson 5 on American Bandstand, gangsters, television shows, Cliff Huxtable, black boys playing handball, sports figures. Any others? Images of black men, poorly clothed, skinny, and miserable, working as slaves in the history books I would read. Needing help. Hanging on the street corner. Different Strokes in the Cosby Show. Earliest is 4 years old, my father, loving, supportive, and encouraging. Same for my uncle. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Prince and Purple Rain. My family watched the movie when I was 7. So we see these falling into certain groups. We have groups that are athletes, so playing basketball, playing handball, sports figures, Michael Jordan. We see entertainers such as gangster rappers, NWA, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. We see negative views of culture, images of poorly clothed black men, skinny and miserable, right? So just negative cultural images. And I think that's good. So that helps just to show what some of those are. We can go bring the PowerPoint back up. So as you see these, right, in the different ways in which black men are oftentimes portrayed, they end up following into a certain subset of themes, right? And you saw from that there was a large number of contributions, but they all ended up being clustered in a very specific way. And they end up clustering, typically in the work that we do, myself and Dr. Harris, they typically cluster into also the 4 primary types of microaggressions that we typically see this population face. So one is what we call an ascription of intelligence. Well, we don't call it. This is why the work of Daryl Wing Sue. And what it's getting at is this notion that black men are academically inferior. Remember we talked last week about the 3 Ds, distrust, disdain, disregard, right? Those are also embedded in here as well. But black males being depicted as athletes, black males being portrayed as entertainers, in those ways, they're not necessarily portrayed as being academics, right? As being someone who you would typically view as being intelligent. You know, I would say that probably the only example of that pervasively in our culture for many of the individuals who might be watching this was the Cosby Show at that time, right? Though I'm sure, you know, I mean, because he was a doctor, right? So that's important for us to keep in mind. The second is assumption of criminality. We saw, in fact, we could have put, you know, gangsters actually was written up there, right? People put gangsters, they put hoodlums hanging on the corners, right? This assumption that they are criminals, that they're deviant, that they are up to go good. We talked about that extensively last time. Pathologizing culture, viewing people's culture in very negative ways. Negative cultural images, we saw them talking about that. And then the last one is what we call athletic boundedness. And this is a concept that Dr. Harris and I have added to the microaggression literature. And what we talk about is the fact that typically when you see a black man on campus, they can describe an experience, at least some experience that they've had, where they've been asked about being some sort of athlete on campus, right? They're assumed to be athletes, right? And that even to the extent that their worth on a college or university campus is that of an athlete. So we'll hear, for example, of an educator, a well-meaning educator, who's decided, you know, I'm going to try to create relationships with my students. I'm going to go out of my way to just, you know, I went to this session that said, you know what, build personal relationships with students, so that's what I'm going to do. And they want to do that. And so outside the class, they see a black male and they're like, hey, tell me how the season's going. Or, you know, when's the season start? Or what sport do you play? Assuming that, of course, because they're black, they must be playing some sort of sport. So it's this automatic perception that aligns them with that. And so we think that that can be very damaging, especially when we hear in our work that's said to students who aren't athletes or who maybe are athletes but don't want the educators to see them solely through that lens, that they have no worth other than being that of an athlete. So we think that's important to convey. So at this point, that sums up the very intro information that we wanted to do. Again, talking about the importance of love, talking about the importance of understanding implicit bias and how that leads to the 4 primary microaggressions that we see. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Frank Harris III. Dr. Harris is a professor of post-secondary education in the College of Education and co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab at San Diego State University. His research is broadly focused on student development and success in post-secondary education. With more than 50 publications to its credit, probably more than that at this point, Harris's scholarship has been published in leading journals for higher education and student affairs research and practice. He has delivered more than 300 academic and professional presentations throughout his career. His commentary has been sought by high-profile media outlets, including CNN, the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, to name a few. Before joining the faculty at San Diego State University, Harris worked as a student affairs educator and college administrator in the areas of student affairs administration and student crisis support and advocacy, new student orientation programs, multicultural student affairs, academic advising, and enrollment services. He also served as an adjunct professor of speech communication at Los Angeles Trade Tech College. Harris earned a bachelor's degree in communication studies at Loyola Marymount University, a master's degree in speech communication at California State University, Northridge, and a doctorate in higher education from the Rossier School of Education at USC. More importantly than all that, he is one of the most impactful researchers there is on this topic focused on black boys and men, and he's also one of the greatest friends that I have. So let's welcome Dr. Harris. Okay, so we will be taking questions for Dr. Harris. If you have things that you want to ask him, remember that we are using social media to field the questions through Twitter using the hashtag Black Minds Matter. Again, the hashtag Black Minds Matter. I know you have it, but I'll write it again just to make sure. Black Minds Matter. And you can also tag me if you want to. It comes up faster, but you don't have to if you would prefer not to. So, all right. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and scoot up a little bit.
Thank you for the warm introduction.
Absolutely.
Yes, I can't believe you read that whole thing.
It's a long bio. You've done a lot. Okay, so we talked about some questions beforehand that I'm going to ask Dr. Harris. But if you have questions, please post them to the hashtag so we can field those as well. But the first question I wanted to start off with is dealing with your work on masculinity. First of all, can you tell us what the heck that actually means? And, how did you get involved in studying masculinity?
Yeah, certainly. So good question, how it all began. So as you mentioned when you were introducing me to the audience, I really began my career in post-secondary education working in student affairs administration. And one of the responsibilities I had pretty early in my career was working for the vice president of student affairs at the time. His name was Dr. Michael Jackson, who's longtime mentor and supervisor and boss of mine. And one of the things that I had to do in my work with him was to support students who had experienced some kind of crises or some kind of emergency, something unforeseen that happened in their life while they were enrolled at the university. And one of the sort of issues that I had to work on was to partner with the director of the Women's Center at the time. Her name was Lori Strauss, and she would work with women who had survived been sexual assault survivors. And I had to work with the students who were actually the perpetrators of those crimes.
That's heavy.
Yeah. So just working through that, working closely with Lori, and we recognized pretty early on that we were doing a lot as far as the university goes, which we were doing a lot to come up with ways to help women avoid being sexually assaulted, right? One thing that we recognized that wasn't happening was that most of these acts, actually pretty much all of them, that it was men that was perpetrating these acts, but we weren't doing anything to target men. We weren't doing any interventions around, better educating men and really, in many ways, kind of understanding the sort of underlying reasons why men committed sexual assault. We weren't really doing that in a proactive way. So just in partnering with her and just sort of learning more, about how do you really help to reduce rates of sexual assault on the college campus, I was drawn to this notion of looking at masculinity. And, recognizing that masculinity was really at the heart of a lot, not just sexual assault, but a lot of the problems that we were seeing with regard to college men. So we're looking at alcohol abuse, or we looked at underachievement, or we were looking at, any negative behavioral patterns that involve men. Masculinity was really at the heart of it. And not just masculinity for masculinity's sake, but, really recognizing that the ways in which we teach boys to be men, that those lead to a lot of unhealthy patterns and negative ways of seeing oneself as a man. And, just the more I studied that, the more I learned it, the more I became fascinated with it. This was actually before I started really looking at issues that were specific to men of color and looking at Black men as well. So that's sort of how it all started. I, transitioned into a doctoral program shortly thereafter. I got to work with Dr. Shaun Harper, who I understand everybody will have the opportunity to talk with soon. And just, he really encouraged me to really do a thorough job of unpacking masculinity. What does it mean? How does, men's participation in college environments, whether it's fraternities or athletic teams or, all male rest halls, whatever spaces they were in, how does masculinity really help to shape their experience? How is it core and central to their experience? How do college environments influence the ways in which men see themselves as men and influence the behaviors and the things that they did in order to situate their identities as men? So that's a sort of a long story, but that's how I really got into looking at masculinity as a field of study. I recognized that there was a lot of scholarship and research that had been done. So work by a scholar named Michael Messer, who happened to be a professor in sociology at USC when I was studying there. a scholar named Michael Kimmel as well. So there was a rich body of research that looked at masculinity, the social construction of masculinity. And what was also interesting is that even though it was focused on masculinity, these scholars wrote from what they describe as a pro-feminist men's studies perspective, right? So it's using tools, critical tools, and critical analyses of feminism in order to understand masculinity and the social construction of it. So I was just fascinated by it, and it helped to also, I think, help me make sense of some of my own experiences, and get a better sense of who I was. And now I have a son who most of you can't see, but he's sitting over in across the room here. So I think it's helped me better understand my role as a father and all sorts of things. So I like to think that I pursued it for less selfish reasons, but if I'm being completely genuine and honest, there was a little bit of wanting to understand my own experiences that motivated me as well.
So you talked about the fact that the messages that we give boys on how to be men. What are some of those messages, and how does that play out? How does that influence them?
Yeah, great question. So at a pretty early age, and you presented some data on early childhood, and how those experiences really shape the ways in which children see themselves, the ways in which children interact with adults, the ways in which children interact with other children. I think the same is true when it comes to masculinity. So at pretty early ages, there's certain things that we do that are just sort of a part of our sociology in a American context. Even things like when we find out that the sex of a child is going to be a boy, then we purchase trucks. We purchase blue clothing. Then there's a corresponding set of toys and clothes and colors that that are reserved for children who we've learned if their sex is female. So
guilty.
Yeah, right. So there's some things that are kind of ingrained socially constructedly that start to plant those messages and plant those seeds pretty early on, that lets boys know that, listen, you're a boy. This is how boys behave. Boys are not girls. Boys play certain games. Boys are allowed to express certain emotions that boys are not allowed to express certain emotions like, fear, vulnerability. You're not allowed to cry. You have to be tough. You have to be aggressive. There's all these things that we assume are, biologically governed, but in many ways are socially constructed, things that boys learn at very early ages. And what's also interesting is that we have certain ways in which we reinforce those messages and reinforce those behaviors, right? So, I can think about a time in which maybe, as a young boy, I, may have been playing with my cousin's Barbie dolls or something like that, and I would be scolded by, an older adult male in my family. Like, boys don't do that, right? Put the doll down and pick up the truck instead, right? So there's some things that we do as adults to reinforce these messages about what it means to be a boy and eventually what it means to be a man. And that's probably an overly oversimplified way of explaining it. But oftentimes we're not even aware, even as adults, when we're interacting with children in these ways, we're not even aware that we're practicing and reinforcing socially constructed ideas about what it means to be a man, right? Socially constructed masculinity is being a part of that.
So why should educators who are desiring to better support Black boys and men, why should they care about masculinity?
Well, because of the things that I just explained, right? Because the social construction of masculinity is so powerful and so prevalent in the lives of boys, and we'll talk about what that means for Black boys also. It really, in many ways, plays a huge role in shaping their identities, not only their identities as people, but their identities as learners, right? They're, as boys situate themselves in educational spaces, they do that and they filter those experiences through the lens of gender. Gender is a part of how they make sense of that. They organize themselves in terms of, who their peer groups, who their friends are going to be based on gender, the things that they express interest in based on gender. So I would dare to say that we cannot disrupt patterns of underachievement. If we're really concerned about the success of boys, Black boys in education, we have to understand the important role that gender plays in shaping who they are as people, and how do they experience education through the how does gender influence the ways in which they experience and make sense of their educational experiences?
Oh, that's very powerful. So I've heard you use the term hegemonic masculinity.
Yes.
Can you explain what that means for an audience that might not be as steeped in the literature as you are?
Right, yes. Hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic, the word hegemonic really originates from the concept of hegemony. And if we think about hegemony, we can think about it as a concept that describes hidden, beneath the surface, stealth ways of being and experiencing a phenomenon. So when we think about hegemonic masculinity, and again, I'm really oversimplifying this a little bit, but we can think about it as the hidden effects of masculinity. So here's why that's important. A lot of the things that we assume are important about what it means to be a man, a lot of the things that the sort of taken for granted assumptions and definitions about masculinity are actually harmful, right? So when we tell boys that you have to restrict your emotions, right? You're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to show vulnerability, you have to be tough, you have to man up. Those are actually harmful messages for boys, right? And when boys internalize those messages and act accordingly, it's actually not conducive to their, to really being fully functioning, healthy, thriving human beings.
Okay, but
right.
Okay, so you're right, but
I might.
No, I'm going to stop you for a second. But as a father, right, I might think to myself, if I don't do that, then he's going to get picked on. He's going to be bullied.
Right, and that's why this notion of hegemonic masculinity is so important, because it hides the hidden effects of masculinity in ways that we become complicit in our own oppression, so to speak, as it relates to gender and masculinity, right? So I don't even recognize, right? Yes. So, what happens is I simply practice and reinforce the messages about masculinity that were reinforced within me as a kid. And I impose those same ideas on my kids, not recognizing the cost or the detrimental effects of that, right? So there's also, related to this concept of hegemonic masculinity, there's a psychologist, a researcher, his name is Jim O'Neill, who talks about male gender role conflict. That's directly, and it parallels really nicely with hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity is a sociological concept. Male gender role conflict is really the psychological manifestations of what we see when it comes to hegemonic masculinity. So for example, O'Neill says this about male gender role conflict. When men, we can even broaden this to boys as well. So when boys and men recognize that they're really not able to fully live up to the expectations that are imposed upon them as it relates to gender and masculinity, right? Because no guy can be tough, aggressive, this physical specimen, like all the things. There's a long list that we can write here if we had the time to do it. But no one could really truly live up to all of the socially constructed expectations around masculinity. And when we recognize that we can't do that, then O'Neill says a couple things happens. First, we experience anxiety and conflict, right? This imposter syndrome, so to speak, where we recognize that, oh no, I'm not really like the guy, or I'm not really living up to what it means to be a man. And I'm worried that everyone is going to recognize that, everyone's going to figure that out, and then they're going to see me, and it's going to result in me being ostracized, bullied, all the things that we get concerned about, right? People are going to see me as less of a man. And it's one thing that I've learned at a pretty early age that the last thing I want to be is seen as less than a man, right? If I'm really embracing this notion of what it means to be a man. So the conflict and anxiety happens, and then the second part of it, what do you think happens then? You want to take a guess? What do?
We try to cover it up and overproject.
We overcompensate, exactly, right? So, think about the 19-year-old sophomore who, engages in binge drinking, is out trying to, have sexual relationships with multiple women, and who's engaging in a lot of other risky behavior. Well, in many ways, it's a manifestation of male gender role conflict. It's that young man's attempts to cover up the fact that he's not really living up to all the things that he assumed he has to live up to in order to be valued and respected and appreciated as a man. Now, so I think we would all agree that the risky behavior and the things that I described are harmful, that these aren't good things. These don't allow us to be thriving, fully functioning, thriving human beings, right? So that's where, but we don't even recognize that part of it, because when we talk about hegemonic masculinity, it's the meanings and assumptions and the effects are beneath the surface. They're hidden. They're hegemonic in that way. So we sort of become complicit in our own oppression in many ways as it relates to gender.
Okay.
Yes.
I've heard you talk about other ways in which that's manifested as well, though, right?
Yes.
In terms of homophobia.
Yes, right. So, and again, going back to O'Neill's theory of male gender role conflict, there's 6 patterns of male gender role conflict. There's 6 ways in which conflict manifests. And for the students who are in the class, this will be on the test, so write these down, okay?
All right, what are some of those?
All right, so
you don't have to remember all 6.
Homophobia is one of them.
Okay.
Right.
Is risky behavior one of them?
Risky behavior is not one of them, but I think all of these patterns lead to some performance of risky behavior, right? So when we think about homophobia, it's directly related to men's fear of femininity. So, what ends up happening is because men have this irrational fear of being perceived as feminine, right? One thing that they do is that they engage in homophobia as a way to, again, overcompensate for the fact that they don't really feel like the men that they, A, assume they have to be, and B, the men that they tell all their friends that they are, right? So one way to do that is to be, oppressive and homophobic would be one way. Sexist behavior plays out in a similar way. This isn't one of the 6, but
okay.
If you like to break it down, you can. Right, sure. Some other things or some other ways that we see it play out are, healthcare problems, right? So when we think about men being afraid to go to the doctor, when we hear about men being afraid to seek psychotherapy, to engage in behaviors that are beneficial for their health, that men don't do it because in doing so, the assumption is that, well, I'm weak and I'm vulnerable if I have to go to the doctor, if I have to seek help, which often results in healthcare problems. Healthcare problems also manifest in which we abuse substances. So, alcohol, tobacco, illicit drugs, things like that. So there's 6. I actually should have wrote.
This is good. I think good framing. Now, is this notion of masculinity, is it for all men, or are there specific ways in which masculinity kind of plays out for Black men?
So what we just talked about is generally accepted and understood to be the experiences of all men.
Okay.
Right. So it's sort of germane to the concept of masculinity, or to experiencing masculinity. Now, there's also been quite a bit of work, really good work, that has looked to make sense of how do men of color, and in particular Black men, experience masculinity, or how do men who have physical disabilities experience masculinity, right? Or how do men from low-income background, right? Recognizing that the masculine ideal, so all the things that we say you have to be, tough, aggressive, successful, physically imposing, white, right? That those concept of masculinity are in many ways shaped and reserved for white men, right? That it's really white men who have the opportunity to really, maximize this concept of what it means to be a man, because how we define masculinity in the United States is based on the experiences of white men as the dominant male group in our country.
Okay.
So what does that mean if you are ethnic minority, right? You can't live up to the masculine ideal, because the masculine ideal is, again, it's based on the experiences of white men, or if you are, a Muslim man. So there's been some scholars. So Tyrone Howard, our colleague at the University of California, Los Angeles, who I understand is partaking in this course as well, talked about, has done a lot of work around stereotypes that are experienced by Black men. And he says that there are really 5 prevailing stereotypes of Black men. You talked about them when you presented the work on microaggressions, but he talked about the anti-intellectual, the physical brute, the hypersexual person, the criminal, and the last one is like the pimp or the hustler, right? The person who's up to no good. So think about that.
Positive.
Those are not very right. So because those are the ways in which Black masculinity is socially constructed in our country, it's going to be real hard to kind of live up to the masculine ideal when that's the way people see you, right? Folks who interact with you at school, folks who interact with you in your communities, folks who interact with you at work are really seeing you through this stereotypical perspective of what a Black man is, right? And what a Black man is, right? So because of that, you can never, as a Black man, you can never fully actualize what it means to be a quote unquote man in the American U.S. context, because that definition of masculinity, the concept of masculinity, wasn't really created for you, right? It really wasn't, right? So what ends up happening, so there's these scholars, Richard Majors and Janet Bilson, Majors and Bilson, talked about this concept of cool pose.
I've heard about that.
All right?
Yeah,
so
about cool pose.
So cool pose is interesting because they say this: because Black men in the United States experience racial stereotypes, racial oppression, that are in many ways dehumanized, and dare I even say emasculated, that what they've done is kind of redefine in many ways what it means to be a Black man, right? So cool pose is an attempt to do that. So they say, the way that cool pose manifests behaviorally is through these unique ways of speaking, unique ways of walking, unique ways of dressing, unique ways of styling one's hair. And so part of that is cultural. Those are ways to express culture, to express Black culture, but it's also part of a way to reclaim some dignity and some respect as men, to redefine what it means to be a man, to be a Black man, right? Because my day-to-day experience tells me that I'm not really a man based on the way that I'm treated in society, right? I can never live up, the accumulation of material wealth is another way in which masculinity is socially constructed and enacted behaviorally in our country. Well, as a Black man, it's kind of hard for me to accumulate material wealth because I'm consistently running into, economic barriers and all these things that make it difficult for me to accumulate material wealth in ways that, my white peers can. So what do? So I have to redefine, and I have to redefine what it means to be a man in ways that are aligned with my culture and aligned with my experience. And cool pose is a way to sort of to theorize about that and make sense of that. So, they called it cool pose. The book was written in 1992. I think the latest way of thinking about it is swagger, right? It's
Yeah.
like as a black guy, it's important for me to have swagger. It's important for me to come across as confident, as come across in a way that expresses confidence and reassurance and strength and pride in who I am. And that's what it means to be a black man, or to reclaim some dignity and respect as a man in a society that does everything that it can to emasculate me and to dehumanize me.
So one of the articles for this week
Yes.
is your co-post piece,
Uh-huh.
right? Where you
Yes.
talk about how that then relates to success.
Right.
So can you make that bridge for us? How does acting cool prevent someone from being successful in school? Or does it? I mean, I don't know.
Well, here's what was interesting about that piece. Those were guys that were all black guys. They were all enrolled at a very selective private research university. So these are guys who had, as far as academic success goes, these guys were incredibly successful, right? Just being able to be, to be students who were admitted to this institution. Some of them were, not many of them were athletes. There may have been, a couple who were student athletes in the sample, but most of these were guys who were on scholarship, who were really successful guys. But what was interesting is that they still experienced this tension around, yeah, I'm successful. I'm a student at this prestigious institution. I'm doing well. I'm going to law school. I'm going to medical school, but I still feel this pressure to protect myself and to not be vulnerable and to not, to allow others to see weakness, right? So how did that play out, and what are some of the things that we experienced? They talked about, homophobia was a prevalent thing, right? That these guys really struggled with homophobia, right, in a real significant way, right? They also struggled with sexism. So they talked about, the type of relationships that they pursued with women and why that was important to them and how it was kind of a part of what they did. While at the same time, they talked about being really good students. They talked about, recognizing that they saw it as part of their responsibility to earn good grades and to be successful men in ways that were probably aligned with, the sort of traditional ways in which masculinity is constructed in our country. So, I think the key point is that masculinity is an identity, and identities are very fluid, and identities are shaped by context. So we cannot really assume anything. We can't assume that because a guy is, positioned in a certain way, that he's not struggling to make sense of his identity as a man, right? More often than not, he is. And I dare I say, speaking personally, I am too, right? In a lot of ways. I mean, this is something that I think about a lot. The question of, who am I as a man, and what type of man do I want to be, and how do I want others to see me as a man? I mean, I think those are questions that I ask myself every single day. And I study masculinity, right? I do this.
You're the expert,
right? So-called, right? So, I think that the sort of key point there is that identity is fluid, and then it's also important to recognize that we're talking about masculinity, but we have to recognize and talk about what are our other salient identities that intersect our gender identities, right? Our race, our sexual orientation, and other salient identities, and how does that shape and create a unique experience for us as men, as black men, right? As men who are enrolled at a university and all the things that come with that.
Okay. So now I'd like to turn to the three things that we know are influencing success for black men based upon the work that we've been able to do together.
Yes.
Could you talk about those three concepts and why they're important?
So here's what we know, and we see this in a lot of the data that we collect.
And I should
help
say
seeking,
this is going to be the last question before we get to
okay,
because there's a lot of questions that came in for you. So
yeah, certainly. So help seeking.
Okay.
So we know that the guys that are willing and able to be proactive in seeking out help, and help could be, you know, I'm struggling with this concept, I need to go and talk with the professor about it, or, you know, I need some help in getting this paper edited before I submit it. Whatever help is, right? Or I'm struggling financially, I need to ask someone, you know, to support me in that way. Help, if being willing and able to seek out help proactively is a real factor. The second part of it is this, seeing school as this gender neutral space, right? Because when we think about, again, thinking about early childhood, and let's not even say early childhood, let's even fast forward to elementary school experiences, elementary school and middle school. Boys, and particularly Black boys, have a tendency to see school or see these spaces as feminine spaces, right? Mm-hmm. So they, at a pretty early age, they sort of disconnect and say, you know, all the guys who are doing well, who sit in front of the class, who answers all the questions, who follows the rules, who does all the stuff that the girls do, those are the guys that get beat up on the playground. Those are the guys that have a hard time making friends. And I don't want to be that guy, so I'm going to kind of disconnect from this, right? Disengage. Or when we think about the lack of educators of color, particularly Black male educators in these spaces, it's hard because they don't really see educators with whom they readily identify. So they start to learn at a pretty early age, or assume at a pretty early age, that, you know, schooling and academia is really not a space that's suited for me as a Black boy, because I don't really see a whole lot of representation here. But where do I see representation? Who are the most prominent Black men that I see, right? And think about this since, you know, sort of the pre-Obama era. It's athletes, it's entertainers, right? It's not folks who are teachers, it's not folks who are school principals. The most popular guys at school it's not the valedictorian, it's the quarterback, it's right. So so when young men can see school, so really reject all those ideas, those socially constructed ideas about gender and schooling and masculinity, and see school as a gender neutral space, they tend to thrive and do better. The last one is related to breadwinner orientation. So again, when we think about how masculinity is socially constructed in our country, particularly in family situations, one thing that you learn or you assume at a pretty early age that you have to do, that the role of the man in the home is to do what? To put food on the table, to go out to earn money and to put food on the table by any means necessary, whatever it takes. So this idea that I'm in school, I'm in college, is really a means to an end to get a job or secure some type of employment that will allow me to fulfill this idea of being a breadwinner. So we often hear, I mean, you know this, you know, when we ask guys, so, you know, what are you interested in? What do you want to study? Well, I'm interested in studying business. Why? Well, because they make money, right?
Yeah.
Right.
First thing I say.
Yeah. So, you know, part of what we have to do, and I'm kind of jumping to implications here, I apologize, but part of what we have to do is to get young men to embrace the concept of school, not through a breadwinner lens, but through this idea that being in school is going to expose me to, you know, I'll be in the most diverse setting I'll ever probably be in my life, right? I'm going to get to learn things and do things that I'm probably never going to get to do as an adult, right? To talk about some of these other important benefits of participating in higher education that have nothing to do with getting a job and have nothing to do with fulfilling a breadwinner role. And I recognize that I say that from a position of privilege, right? That I have to be mindful that higher education is incredibly expensive, and that students are making huge sacrifices, their families are making huge sacrifices for them to participate. So the idea that, you know, for me to say, hey, you shouldn't worry about getting a job or being a breadwinner, that's kind of a, you know, maybe I'm saying that from a position of privilege, but you know, if we're talking about what are the factors that lead to sustained success, right, in post-secondary education and beyond, that lead to healthy masculinities, this is where that comes into play.
And so you talked about this from a a gender standpoint. You
Yes.
brought race in a little bit, but I'd like to bring race in here a little bit.
Of course.
So help seeking.
Yes.
We know that for men of color, there's also a word about being perceived as in, of course, academically inferior, which then makes it even worse. Like, I don't want to ask for help because, as a man, I don't want to be seen as weaker.
Right, because men don't ask for help, and then as a black student, they already think I don't belong here anyway.
Yeah,
and
so
I'm not
put those two together.
Right.
Right.
So why would I ask for help? I'd rather kind of struggle through it, even if it means that I don't do as well as I should. Because one thing I don't want to do is to prove what others are already assuming. Right. That's like the worst thing I could do. So I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to ask for help.
Yeah.
And I'm certainly not going to ask for help from a professor who already sees me as dumb, unintelligent, and all these things, right? And who doesn't really, and in the end, doesn't really care if I'm successful or not anyway. I mean, that's sort of the script, right? That's playing, in one's mind when it comes to that.
The other thing is with a breadwinner orientation.
Yes.
So I think about what we found with black men in particular in the kind of work opportunities that are available to them when they're in college. So we did a study that looked at black men in community colleges, and we found that they had 3 different types of work that was available to them to essentially try to live out this breadwinner.
Yes.
Right? That they were, one, in terms of the jobs that were available to them, they were in jobs that were physically demanding. They were moving boxes, digging ditches, stocking shelves, doing construction site cleanups.
Right.
Second, they were in jobs that occurred late at night, so they either worked the late night shift or the overnight shift, get off work at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. First class is at 8 a.m. And what happens at 8 a.m.? They get into class, they're groggy, they just did all their best they could just to get there. They sit in the back, they're tired. The professor looks at them and says, see, they don't care, they don't even belong here. Right. And then the last one that we saw is that they were in jobs that were temp jobs, right? So they're in one job for a period of time, then out of that job, and then another job for a period of time, and out of that. And I'm thinking about it through a racial lens. So it's even harder than to even be able to live out being this breadwinner if you're a black man, right? So there's this masculine ideal that you're talking about, and I guess that goes back to the whole piece of co-pose, right? That's the whole, I guess, thing, right? Is that there's a certain type that you're supposed to be a box that you're supposed to be able to fit into, and because we can't fit into it, then we're
got to create our own box.
Yeah, got to create our own box.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful. Okay, so there's a lot of questions that have come in. And so what we're going to do is get to those. So I'm going to just read a few of them to you here as they've come in. It says, here's a question. Does male gender role conflict, and you might want to answer these quickly for each one because there's a lot of questions.
Right.
Does male gender role conflict breed more risky behavior in black men compared to white men?
I can't say that it does because I haven't studied it in that way, and I don't want to be irresponsible and assume, make an assumption, a theoretical assumption. My sense is male gender role conflict. It plays out similarly from black men that it does. It plays out in similar ways. I think the key point is this when it comes to male gender role conflict. A is that there is conflict.
Yeah.
There is conflict and there's anxiety, right? And that we feel intense pressure to resolve it. Now, what we do to resolve it is going to depend on, again, other aspects of our identity, the context of the space in which we're situated, a lot of other things that we have to account for. But to answer that question, I would say I'm inclined to say no.
Okay. So here's the next question. How can we affirm black males' performance and fluidity of masculinity in today's society? How can we affirm the positive elements of being a man?
Great question. First, we have to recognize that there is no black masculinity. Right?
Okay.
We have to think about black masculinity in very pluralistic ways, right? So we have to think about black masculinities. There's so many different ways to be a black man. There's so many different versions of black masculinities in our country. Now we tend to recognize and prioritize about 3 of them, right?
Okay.
But we got to think that there's lots of different ways. And I think part of our role as educators is to really first recognize and expose young men to the various versions of masculinity, right? And how do we do that? Through books, through guest speakers, through films, through assignments, right? So we have to do that. But probably the most important thing we could do is give boys and young men permission to be their authentic selves, right? So we have to tell them that, who you are is good enough. You don't have to try to be someone else or something else. Is a big part of what we have to do.
Okay, this question comes from Stacy Teeters, who's watching this and I was also in the room.
Yep.
Has your research on hegemonic masculinity changed how you interact with students or your parenting?
Yeah, absolutely. I like to think it's made me a better parent. I don't know. What do you think, AJ? Yeah? Just say yes, son. Never mind. I like to think it's made me a better parent than I would be had I not taken this up as a field of study. It certainly influenced the ways in which I interact with students.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this question comes from Dan Perez. How do we combat peer group influence that restricts self-worth as a learner?
How do we combat?
I think in the context of like that negative peer influence about what it means to be a man.
Oh yeah. So this is a cool question too. So Shaun Harper, who you all will get to meet shortly, he and I did a study 3 years ago that looked specifically at, and this study wasn't specific to Black men, but it was looking at men in fraternities who embrace and embody, positive aspects of what it means to be a man, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about, really it was a study of healthy and positive masculinities. And there's a lot that we learned from that study. But one thing that was really important is that we have to empower and reward the few young men who are willing to sort of step out against the norm and say, hey, I'm not cool with this, or who are willing to disrupt the narrative, the dominant narrative about masculinity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to recognize those young men. We have to validate them. We have to tell them, yeah, Luke, you're right. The ways in which your peers are sort of pursuing this is not right, and the way you're thinking about it is correct. And we have to surround them with other like-minded men who also embrace a positive and healthy concept of what it means to be a man.
Okay. 2 more questions for you. This one comes from Preston Clark and says, what can we do to halt the early introduction to violence we give our boys? Examples being toy guns and violent sports.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to kind of rethink the ways, the games that we play, with young boys. We have to rethink the messages that we convey to them. We have to be willing to be affectionate with them, right? We have to hug our sons, and we have to tell them we love them. We have to do things that are not considered quote unquote masculine, right? But we have to recognize that these are human qualities. These are things that human beings need. That it's not a masculine thing or a feminine thing, right? That we have to embrace the full aspect of what it means to be a human being. Yeah, regardless of what our gender identity may be.
This question comes from Angie Barfield, and she says, as a Black female educator, how can I effectively support Black males and engage their masculinity? There's several questions that are very similar to that.
So here's what's interesting. Here's what I've learned over the years from studying masculinity is that a lot of times the pressure, men perform masculinity for other men, right? So a lot of times, and it's men that often validate the masculinities of other men. So a lot of times, and I've heard, guys over the years tell me this, that they feel more comfortable talking to, women who are important in their lives than they do the men in their lives. So I think it's important that we shouldn't assume that, because I identify as a woman or because I'm a woman that I can't engage or have a conversation to support young men in developing healthy masculinities. For some young men, you are probably going to be better positioned than the adult men in their lives, right? So really the key is just, we say this in the work that we do, you don't have to be a man of color or, to support a man of color, but you have to understand their lived experiences and engage them based on that, right? So you have to understand what are some of the challenges or what are some of the things that they're experiencing some of the behaviors that frustrate you to no end, where is that coming from, right? And not allow that to, serve as a barrier in you developing a relationship with them. And it doesn't mean you can't challenge them. One of the questions that, that I often like to ask students that I'm supporting, students that I'm mentoring is that, who do you give the power and authority to define for you what it means to be a man, right? And when I ask them that, usually they're like, whoa.
Yeah, I just did that right now.
Like, that's kind of a big question, right?
Yeah.
But, really it sort of speaks to this idea that you have agency to define and be the man that you want to be, right? And you have to assume that agency. You have to use it. You have to actualize it. Don't go with the flow. Don't just do something because you assume that that's what others expect you to do. That's not being in an ironic way. That's, when we think about it, that's not being a quote unquote man, right? So, I think it's important to kind of challenge them and push them in that regard and ask them that. And I think when you do that, really it's all about getting them to reflect critically, reflecting critically on who they are as men, who do they want to be, right? And who do they give the power and authority to define for them what it means to be a man.
Thank you for joining us.
Right.
We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Appreciate it.
That was very, very insightful and very helpful. So as we move into the last part of our course for today, we really just want to reaffirm the challenge that we have given everyone. So let me get this erased real quick. And again, this challenge relates to doing the 1-minute video. So again, it's a 1-minute video. It's the Affirming Black Minds Challenge. And again, with the video, just beginning it with Black Minds Matter because, and then whatever you want to say after that. This is a challenge that we give to you to help us portray a different type of message about this population. We are now joined by Dr. Shaun Harper. As you know, Shaun is one of the most prolific scholars as it comes to, and influential, not just prolific, but prolific and influential when it comes to work on Black boys and men. I am sure he wouldn't necessarily love this characterization, but I view him as the Du Bois of our time. And I'm just going to read you a short bio of his and then turn it over to him to be able to talk about the incredible work that he's been doing. So Dr. Shaun R. Harper is an American scholar and racial equity expert in the United States. He is also one of the most highly cited, highly ranked, and quoted and prolific professors in the field of education. He is the Clifford and Betty Allen Professor at the University of Southern California Rosier School of Education and the Executive Director of the USC Center on Race and Equity. He spent a decade at the University of Pennsylvania where he was a tenured professor and founding Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Equity in Education. Harper is best known for his research on race and gender in education and social contexts, equity trends, and climate issues on college campuses, Black and Latino male student success in urban high schools and in higher education, college student engagement, and intercollegiate athletics. He has published 12 books and over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles and other academic publications and received more than $12 million in research grants and contracts. Professor Harper's research has been cited in over 7,000 published studies. That's amazing. He is the president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education and was previously a member of President Barack Obama's My Brother's Keeper Alliance Advisory Council. So at this point now, we'll turn over to Dr. Harper, and thank you so much for joining us. It's really a pleasure and an incredible honor to have you here today.
Hey, thank you so much, Professor Wood. I am so thrilled to have gotten your invitation to participate in this important series. I am a huge fan of yours, very likely your biggest fan and appreciator of your work. I certainly am also really appreciative of your leadership in organizing this series. Man, you have such a dynamic cast of people, and I'm very honored to be among them. I figured that I would spend this time talking about making Black boys and men matter, and using my work over the past 18 years now as just one example of what it looks like to, come at mattering from a multitude of angles. I thought that it might be, really useful to colleagues and others who are joining in from across the country, as well as your students there at San Diego State, to just really get a sense of what it means to take on an opportunity and to commit to it in an assorted sort of multitude of ways, which has been sort of the project of my career and really what I consider to be a lifelong commitment. So, let me just start by saying that, Luke, I appreciate that you and I had an opportunity to do an incredible book project together on advancing Black male student success from preschool through PhD. In many ways, the title of our book, I think, really captures much of what I've attempted to do, over these nearly 2 decades of doing work with and on behalf of Black boys and men. So what I want to do here very quickly is just talk through a couple projects, a handful of projects, probably about a half dozen, and just sort of share with folks, what I was thinking at the time and, sort of what the particular motive was for that project and how it fits in this larger landscape of really sort of a mission of work on making Black boys and men matter. Let me start here by saying that what I think perhaps has been my sort of pioneering and sort of original contribution to, a really robust and important collection of work on Black boys and men was to sort of take on, these deficit narratives like the one that my colleague, USC Professor Charles Davis and I took on in our article, that they don't care about education, right? There are these just really sort of very racist and very long-standing narratives that education is unimportant to Black boys and men and to their families and to our communities, which is just largely inconsistent with my experience. I came to this because when I was in graduate school, just about everything assigned to me to read about Black people generally, and certainly about Black boys and men specifically, was all deficit oriented. Around questions concerning higher education, it was, why do so many of us drop out of high school and continue on to higher ed? Why are we so underprepared for the rigors of college level work when we get there? Why are we so disengaged? Why are we so academically underperforming? And, why do so few of us ultimately persist through college completion and degree attainment? Those are really important questions. And I've argued now, really over 2 decades that, we ought not continue or discontinue pursuit into the explanatory undercurrents of those questions, particularly in ways that are structural, that helps us understand structures that undermine Black male possibility and Black male success. So again, I absolutely believe that we continue to need scholarship that answers those questions. But on the other hand, my project has been around helping people understand that there are Black boys and men who thrive. There is this whole notion now, was one of my favorite things, of Black male or Black boy joy, right? That we aren't all just, sort of beaten down, just, failing, lifeless, hopeless, and so on. That, there are some Black males who succeed educationally, who succeed occupationally, who succeed in, other aspects of their lives. So I've just tried to take on, very much in a counter-narrative kind of way, this project of helping people understand that, there are Black boys and men who, despite the odds we know to be stacked against them, thrive and succeed. So, I've had to do that in a number of ways. Certainly this article with Charles was one way. Niggers No More was another way, in a way that I just really took on, this notion of Black males being niggered in, a multitude of ways. And one of those ways I argued was, sort of the one-sided, mischaracterization of our lives, that if you only read bad news about Black boys and men, that is a way in which we are persistently niggered in the literature, in media, and certainly in the American imagination. I think that Trayvon Martin, for example, was murdered by George Zimmerman because Zimmerman, like many Americans, have been sold a singular narrative about who Black boys and men are. So when Zimmerman saw Trayvon Martin in this gated neighborhood, this gated community, his presumption was that he had to have been up to no good. He didn't belong there. There's no way he could possibly live there, or his family, his Black family, could have possibly lived there. Why did Zimmerman think this? Probably because just about everything that Zimmerman had consumed in the media, I bet he probably wasn't reading social science research, but just about everything he was consuming in the media were these one-sided portrayals of who Black boys and men are. So I've tried to take this on and help the nation and really the world to view Black boys and Black men differently. So Niggers No More really was, for me, my attempt at helping people understand how one of the most derogatory characterization of Black people, men and women, niggers, is an actual actionable way, that it plays itself out in an actionable way when we characterize and view, Black life in very limited and stereotypical and hopeless ways. Part of my project has been certainly, and when I say project, I don't mean just one research project. I mean really the project of my career, in this particular domain. Part of my project has been firmly situated in higher education, but another part of it has been, concerned with Black males in the larger social sphere, in certainly in high schools. So a team of researchers and I from the University of Pennsylvania, the institution I left this summer to come west to the West Coast, to USC. A team of researchers and I did this 40-school study of Black and Latino male student success in 40 public high schools across New York City. These were all graduate students, one postdoc and me from Penn, who traveled over 5 months from Philly to New York City, looking for ourselves in lots of ways. In the report that was written from this project, Succeeding in the City, there is a page that has this photo of the research team, and it has a headline that says, Meeting Ourselves. And, really, we went there in these 40 schools looking for Black and Latino boys, juniors and seniors, who were college bound, college ready, definitely going to college. All these boys are in college now. We somehow knew they were there. We knew they were there because we, as Black and Latino men ourselves, were once those boys. But so little attention had been placed on, understanding how we navigated, urban schooling, public schooling, inequitable schooling, into higher education and through higher education and onward to an Ivy League university. We thought that there was something that, would be quite instructive about going to 40 public high schools, traditional public high schools, and finding these boys and telling their narratives. It wasn't that we just wanted to share feel-good stories about them. We wanted to offer some instructive insights into the factors that the institutional factors, familial factors, community factors, and so on, that led to their educational success, because those are the kinds of things that could be scaled and replicated. So in other words, when we only focus on Black males who are not succeeding in school, we don't learn anything about success. But when we study and spend time with, boys who are, again, successful despite the odds that we know to be stacked against them, those are the things that provide some learning opportunities for us. And that was what we were attempting to do in these 40 schools with the 419 or the 425 young men who were a part of this study. That wasn't my first go around with this particular kind of work. A prelude to the New York City study was my National Black Male College Achievement Study that took me to 42 colleges and universities in 20 different states across the country. You see a list of the participating institutions here, and you'll notice that they're dispersed across geographic region and across institution type. I was a young boy early in my career when I took on this project, so I didn't have like this 13-member research team. It was just me who went to these 42 campuses and conducted 2 to 3 hour individual interviews with Black undergraduate men who were highly engaged, academically high performing, guys who were taking advantage of enriching educational experiences and opportunities like study abroad, summer internships in their fields, research programs with faculty, and so on. I was looking for total package guys like the ones that I just described, because again, anybody who had done any reading of the literature on Black males in higher education could be easily convinced that there are no such men who are total package, highly engaged, academically high performing men at colleges and universities. I knew that was untrue, right? As I read that stuff, I didn't see my own college narrative and the narrative of my closest friends and my fraternity brothers and so on represented in that literature. And I wanted to, by going to these places and meeting these men and, sharing their lives and their, again, insights into their success trajectories, I just wanted to be helpful. I wanted to be both disruptive of these dominant narratives about them, but also helpful in unmasking, the factors that led to their success. For that particular study, I constructed what I call an anti-deficit achievement framework. I very deliberately, when I crafted this framework, I didn't call it an assets-based framework. I called it anti-deficit because that, at least at the time, that was my activist stance. I was actively resisting deficit, dominant, one-sided, racist, hopeless narratives about Black men, right? So for this particular framework, I took on these commonly asked questions about underachievement and I flipped them inside out. So in other words, I was looking for the upside of achievement. So let me give you one example. If you look in the sort of the middle section of the left side of the screen in the K-12 school forces, there's the second question about how do Black male students negotiate academic achievement alongside peer acceptance? That was my way of taking on the Fordham and Ogbu acting white hypothesis, which has been written about quite extensively. That, if there's a Black male student who is doing well in school, he's accused of acting white by his peers. And therefore, that leads him to sort of resist that characterization and not perform so well in school. Honestly, that doesn't tell us a thing about Black male success. I was more interested in, how do guys, boys, young men, how are they both popular and, members of social networks with other Black students, women and men, but also academically high performing. Because the whole acting white thing was just like inconsistent with my observations. And it was also inconsistent with work by, brilliant social scientists like Margaret Beale Spencer, who's a psychologist. I am persuaded by Spencer's work and other people's work who've taken on the acting white hypothesis that it's not the achievement that gets one accused of acting white. It is when one adopts the I am better than you stances that white people often adopt in schooling situations, in interactions with black people. That's the thing that makes black people be like, yeah, you treated me like white folks treat me. One of the things that I've discovered in this national study was that black people are actually really proud of black people when we do well. So yeah, I needed to find out, like, well, how do guys who are in college who are doing well, how do they negotiate, peer support? That's just one of a number of examples that are situated here in this anti-deficit framework. I'll give just one more. There's a lot of conversation about disengagement, about black male disengagement, both inside and outside of the classroom. I was more interested in black male students who are engaged. What was the impetus for their engagement? What compelled them to become engaged if engagement is, perhaps not culturally normative among other black male students? And what might we learn from those who are engaged that could inform our approach in engaging the masses and engaging those who are disengaged? So listen, I am going to talk for just a few more minutes, and then I'm going to open this up. I want to have some dialogue with folks who are tuned in here virtually. Let me just say too about this anti-deficit framework. Again, it's not just about changing the narrative, but it is also about being instructive. So for example, my colleague, Professor Christopher Newman, who's at University of San Diego, he and I wrote about, black male students' first year transitions. Well, you can't write about, how black male students successfully transition if you don't pursue insights from those who have successfully transitioned, right? And learning from their transition experiences, the kinds of, again, institutional factors and conditions that allowed them to transition seamlessly and successfully from high school to college. Another piece of this particular study, which it draws on data from my National Black Male College Achievement Study, was that not all the men, all the 219 men in the national study, not all of them got off to a smooth start in their first year. Some of them had turbulent first year experiences, but Professor Newman and I were really interested in, all right, you had these turbulent first year experiences, but what happened that allowed you to successfully overcome that initial transition turbulence, right? Like, you had a terrible freshman year, but now you have a 3.7 GPA. How did that happen, right? And what is it that we can learn from your success trajectory that might allow us in our approaches, in our counseling approaches and other approaches with, black male students who might be on academic probation, right? Like, what can we learn about sort of pivotal moments in, one's academic transition? I'll give another. In my Harvard Educational Review article on black male students' resistant responses to racist stereotypes, I attempted to help us understand how black male students who are confronted with stereotypes and microaggressions and overt racism and being called a nigger and all of these other things, right? Like, how do they resist the internalization of these stereotypes and these other racist encounters that they have? Because the literature from psychology suggests that when one is confronted with racism in these ways, that one withdraws academically, one loses academic interest and becomes, sort of overwhelmed by, these experiences and so on. Well, these guys in my national study were clearly still performing very well academically. They were still very much engaged. The racism that they encountered didn't, compel them to withdraw or drop out or disconnect from the educational experiences. So I wanted to understand, well, how was it that these guys were able to resist, these racist stereotypes and, still thrive personally and educationally? The work is, this 18-year project of mine, hasn't just been about, understanding sort of individual notions of success, but it has also been about transforming institutions. With a grant from Lumina Foundation, I undertook this 3-year project that was all about helping institutions assume responsibility for Black male success, and using a set of standards that John Kirkendall, who's the University of Arkansas Little Rock, and I created, to put those things into practice on their campuses. So we worked with, at our center, our former center at Penn, we worked with 5 institutions over a 3-year period to take the best of what we had learned from my National Black Male College Achievement Study and institutionalize it in a set of projects, institutional and organizational change projects. So it's my way of saying that my work hasn't been just for scholars and academic audiences, but it has very much also been for practitioner audiences and audiences of institutional change makers. And this one Lumina funded project is just one example of how I've attempted to put my work into practice. Certainly, I've, tried to not only, use qualitative data, but also use statistics and quantitative data to raise national consciousness about inequities that disproportionately impact and affect Black male students. I hope I didn't, let me make sure that I'm not contradicting myself here. In a project like the one that you see on the screen here, which is a report published in 2016 about Black male student athletes and racial inequities in NCAA college sports, Division I sports, on the one hand, my project has been about disrupting one-sided narratives. But on the other hand, it has also been about raising national consciousness about inequities. But I think that my approach has been to not attribute those inequities to Black boys and men, but instead to help people understand structures, cultures, and policies that produce, reproduce, and reinscribe inequities. And to make data transparent. The overrepresentation of Black male student athletes in revenue generating sports like football and men's basketball, it's sort of a phenomenon that is hiding in plain sight. We see it very clearly on football fields and on basketball courts. But what I attempted to do in this project was help people understand the extent of the overrepresentation, as well as the extent to which Black male students, 6-year graduation rates, were vastly less and vastly lower than their white male teammates and other student athletes and so on, in a way that I hope would hold institutions accountable. This kind of work has considerable policy traction. In fact, when Arne Duncan was the Secretary of Education, a prior version of this report that we have published 3 years prior caught Arne's attention, and he very much made this a project of his to try to create some policy around, holding sports teams and institutions accountable for these kinds of racial inequities. So I understood that my project can't just be about narrative change and just about institutional transformation, that it has to also have some policy. It has to have a policy component. A policy component that will have macro level effects and that could, perhaps even, have national reach. Luke mentioned in his very generous introduction of me that I had the pleasure of serving on President Barack Obama's My Brother's Keeper Advisory Council. And my role there was to be the bringer of the evidence, the bringer of the data, as the only academic on the council, the only professor on it. That council really relied on me to be, the person to bring the evidence. So that has also been a part of my project. Just a couple more here. My project has also been about expanding Black male possibility beyond myself and, creating a cadre of social scientists and other education researchers who, share the same values that I share and who could use their work and use their platforms, to enact policy change, institutional change, change in communities and in schools and so on. So when I was at Penn, I created this Black male grad prep academy that was all about attracting Black male juniors from colleges and universities across the country and introducing them to careers in the professoriate. So in other words, it was about, as you see here in this diverse issues article that was written about the Academy, it really was about attempting to increase the number of Black men in PhD programs who would then subsequently enter the professoriate and become professors who, would join me and Luke and Frank Harris and Tyrone Howard and, many, many other people who are a part of this series in, doing responsible research on Black boys and men in education. We've now had 4 cohorts of this academy, and the young men that we selected for the academy as juniors from all around the country, went on to pursue PhDs in education, higher ed, ed psych, education policy, and so on at Harvard, Penn, Michigan State, Michigan, UCLA, Duke, Northwestern, and other highly ranked top ed schools around the country. These guys are actually now beginning to, the first cohort, they're beginning to finish their PhDs. 2 of them are now tenure track assistant professors, one at Loyola University Chicago, the other at University of Virginia. And there are many more now in the pipeline who will finish their PhDs and they will become professors. And they will write about Black male success and, a range of other topics concerning Black people, women and men, communities of color, and so on, in anti-deficit ways, in policy informing ways, and so on, in ways that I've frankly, socialized them to do and think. So that has been another way that, I've attempted to do my project by creating a pipeline of others who will continue this work well beyond Luke and me and Frank and others. Certainly, I've also done this through my own advising of doctoral students, my own doctoral students, to be absolutely sure. I've had women who've been doctoral advisees of mine. In fact, I only have 2 more male advisees than I do women who've been my doctoral advisees. But what you see here on the screen is a snapshot of just some of my current and former doctoral advisees who are men of color. Not all of them did dissertations and went on to do work that was focused on Black male success or Black men and Black boys, or some of them have, but all of them do work that very much is focused on people of color and communities of color and equity issues and race and so on. But my point here in sharing this slide is that, you know, in addition to the Grad Prep Academy, part of my project has been understanding that I, as a university-based faculty member, that, you know, I can create, you know, the next generation of scholars who are my students. You know, Frank Harris was my second doctoral advisee many years ago when I was on the USC faculty the first time. And, you know, I'm so ridiculously proud of that guy. I'm so proud of the scholar that he's become. I'm so proud that he's a tenured full professor and that he and Luke Wood are the leading authorities on men of color in community colleges. You know, like, I've resisted sort of the paternalistic sort of claiming of my doctoral students as like my kids. I don't see them as my kids, but, you know, like, Frank was my second doctoral student, right? So, you know, to know that, you know, I can do something about Black male success and success for men of color by creating doctoral students and working with doctoral students who will then go on and do their work in the ways that Frank and Sam Macias and Stephen Quay and others have gone on to do their work, I think is perhaps my biggest contribution in the work that I do on Black male success and the success of men of color. I will conclude by just telling you what I'm up to now in this work, and I'll show a quick video and then I'll stop talking and open this up for some conversation. The goal of RISE is to transform the practice of research and evaluation to improve the lives, experiences, and outcomes of boys and men of color across 5 different areas: health, education, workforce development, human services, and criminal justice.
There's been a lot of energizing conversation about this being a revolution. RISE is very interested in having authentic engagement from a diverse array of stakeholders. And in particular, we're interested in American Indian, Asian American and Pacific Islander, Latino and Hispanic, and African American voices all coming together to talk about the unique assets they bring to this work.
I feel like Native representation in higher education and Native society, we're often considered the asterisks because we're statistically insignificant data sets. And so RISE, coming here, I felt it really reassuring and real validating to know that there are people who are like me and who are maybe even not like me, but who are willing to bring about awareness for our Native peoples.
Really lifting up the RISE principles is what I want folks to walk away from the convening with. I like to think of it as we're deputizing folks to be RISE agents. I want them to be enthusiastic spokespersons for the RISE principles. I want them to tell others with whom they work in their local context and, you know, all across the nation that we are doing the work concerning boys and men of color differently, and that these are the standards and principles that we're using to do that. We are effectively working to transform the practice of research and evaluation by bringing together people in conversation with each other who've never actually talked to each other about what we know, what remains to be known, what standards and metrics we should use, and so on.
I work a lot with data. I care about quality data. And so I'm particularly interested in how we can put together data for both the health sector and the education sector to give us a fuller picture of the opportunities that our boys and men of color have in education and in health. One of the biggest things that I think that I'm taking away is that we need to be very intentional how we collect data and how we use that data to tell like narratives and stories for boys and men of color, and focus on like their success and their positive narratives. But we need to lock arms and work with each other as we continue to do this work. It's not just another research enterprise, but it is really a social movement.
What we really hope happens is that people leave here energized. that they see themselves as powerful and use that power to really bring about change.
All right, so
thank you.
Those are just a handful of examples of a project for me that, again, it's lifelong, but I'm 18 years into it now. So I will stop here and open this up.
Okay, Shaun, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. The first question comes from one of the students who's in the physical class. And for those who want to pose questions to Shaun, again, we're using the hashtag Black Minds Matter. So the question is from Sam Scales. With as much research that has been done on Black boys and men, why has there not been an improvement in graduation rates? What at this point can be done to actually take a step in the right direction?
Yeah, great question. I think that much of the work on, and I don't want to be offensive to colleagues who have been doing work on Black boys and men for a long time. But I think that much of the work has been about things like identities, which is really important, super important, right? But I don't know that enough work has been done on structural determinants and structural undercurrents and structural threats to Black male success. So in other words, yes, a dude can have like a really healthy identity, but if he walks into a classroom and his professor is racist and has really low expectations of him, and there are like these other structural and cultural and systemic things that undermine his success, I'm not sure that his very healthy identity on his own is going to carry him through graduation. So, you know, I've called in my work for more scholarship that focuses on structures, not just individuals. Again, I want to be very thoughtful here. I'm not saying that people should stop caring about individuals or stop caring about identity, but we do need more people to do research on structures, systems, and cultures at institutions that undermine graduation rates. So that's one thing. One other thing that I will say is that institutional leaders oftentimes don't have well-informed strategies for improving Black male success, academic performance, first and second year persistence, and certainly completion, right? Their approach is usually, oh, let's give these guys a club and give them a couple dollars and let them buy pizza and play cards and spades and video games and like hang out. That'll do it. That's gonna, you know, help them feel a stronger sense of belonging. Sure, it might help in some way, I suppose, enhance Black male friendships and perhaps, you know, like put Black men in the company of other Black men for socializing, but those things don't have a thing to do with academics. So there oftentimes isn't an academic strategy, which is a point that Chris Newman and I made in our Teachers College to Record article about the, you know, the success in the first year and all that stuff, that, you know, it can't just be social programming. It's got to also have, you know, academic components.
Thank you, Shaun. The next question comes from another student who is in our class, Mohammed, and he asks about intercollegiate athletics and colleges making millions off of our students. And can you talk a little bit more about that and your work in that area and what you've found? Because I think that for a lot of folks in the room, they feel like it is an abusive system that many of our Black men are engaged in.
Sure. Great question. In that report that I talked about briefly, I think the first line of the report says something like, perhaps nowhere in higher education is the disenfranchisement of Black men more insidious than in intercollegiate athletics. I wrote that, more than a year ago, and I stand by it. I actually believe that. Because, yeah, you're right. Like, institutions make millions of dollars on the backs of Black male student athletes. In the report, I pointed out several things, not just the overrepresentation of them on revenue generating sports teams, and not just, the inequities in graduation rates, but I also pointed out that every commissioner in the Power Five, these are the 5 most economically prosperous and profitable academic conferences, every one of those is led by a white man. I also point out that, while Black men, for example, are more than 55% of football teams or basketball teams and more than 60% of football teams, that Black male coaches are, I forget the stat. I don't have it like right off the top of my head, but it's in the report. I talk about how few Black male coaches there are and how, the most handsomely compensated, people in higher education are white male coaches. And it's Black men who are, earning, these coaches' salaries, and that they're white men. So yeah, I think that's wrong. I think it's absurd. I was encouraged a few years ago when Jonathan Butler at University of Missouri went on a multi-day hunger strike, and then the football team decided to step in support of him, and they threatened to not play their football game that Saturday. And the football team there is overwhelmingly Black. Those Black players said, we're not going to play this week until and unless the president steps down. And what do you know? Suddenly, the president steps down because millions of dollars were at stake, more than $1 million for the game that they were threatening to not play that weekend. That was an encouraging example of Black male student athletes flexing their collective muscle and understanding that they have power. I just wish that we saw more of that on college campuses, and I certainly wish that we saw more of that in the NFL. I have been low-key frustrated that, in the recent weeks, this whole stuff around activism and kneeling and all this stuff, I wish that there had been more NFL players who, threatened to not play unless their particular franchises and the NFL as a franchise did, certain things to, improve Black livelihood and to, help call attention to, police misconduct and all of that stuff, the things that Colin Kaepernick was actually trying to raise our consciousness about when he, initiated this whole thing. I just thought that we had a serious moment in time for those NFL players, most of whom were Black, to pose a bigger threat economically, but, they didn't do it. All right. I'll try to be more concise in the rest of the questions here. Sorry.
No, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, this next question comes from a student, Hassa Sadat, who says, community colleges today discuss disproportionate impact on men of color when it comes to being prepared for college completion and transferring. Yet the actions on equity plans, which are set for Black and Latino males, are not considering a full understanding of these two communities. So her question is, what advice do you have for future leaders in this room on taking important steps to close achievement gaps for Black and Latino men in community colleges?
I think that they should take very seriously the important work that Frank Harris and Luke Wood and their colleagues do. I'm not being charitable or gratuitous here. I think I'm a huge believer in the work that you guys are doing. I just wish that more institutional leaders consulted you guys and read your work and put your work into practice. I think that the answers are in the Black minds of two geniuses at San Diego State. I just want more community college faculty members and leaders to really use your work. That's my real answer. That's not a cop-out. I just what I honestly believe. They should holler at my boys at San Diego State.
Thank you, Shaun. Okay, this question is from Joseph Abraham. He says, given your work with My Brother's Keeper and President Obama's administration, do you believe the current administration at the White House and U.S. Department of Education will have a significant impact on educational equity?
Yep, I sure do. I think it's going to be a disastrous one. I think it's going to be terrible. There are all sorts of efforts to dismantle important policy moves that were made. I know that we're talking about Black boys and men in this series, but let me say that the thing that keeps me awake at night around the current administration, particularly the education department, is the very serious efforts to roll back policies around sexual assault, which sometimes affects boys and men, but more often affects girls and women. I'm disgusted by Betsy DeVos's and others' attempts to just undo the very important legislative work and policy work that was done during the Obama administration. Let me also say that the thing for which I appreciate so much about the Obamas and, really got a chance to work on some important initiatives while they were there. But the thing that I appreciate most about President Obama is that he used his presidential platform to make boys and men of color matter. And I thought that it was brilliant. I thought that it was important. That's not a thing that I think can be undone easily, at least. Through My Brother's Keeper, I think that the president, very much sort of ignited in many ways this whole movement that around Black boy joy and joy for Latino boys and men and Native American and Asian American boys and men. Yeah. All right. So maybe two more. I think I'm starting to tire out here. It's been a very long day. I taught today, and my first meeting on campus this morning was at 8 a.m. And I think my husband is texting to figure out when I'm coming home for dinner. Maybe two more.
We'll just do one more, Shaun.
All right.
Okay. And this is from a student. Then the question is from Stacy Teeters, and it says, do you have advice on how we can encourage educators to reframe their approaches in interacting with these boys? Basically, when they have such a deficit mindset, how do we basically encourage other educators to engage them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that certainly we should expose them to counter narratives about communities of color generally, and in this instance, boys and men of color, in teacher education programs, certainly in professional development and professional learning experiences that are offered in their school buildings and in their districts. So that's part of it, right? I do think that every teacher, every educator in the country should read Advancing Black Male Student Success from Preschool through PhD. It is a shameless plug for mine and Luke's book, because the thing about that book is that it's not a book of problems. In fact, Luke and I say that in the preface, that if you're looking for a book of problems about Black boys and men, this ain't it. You know, every chapter in that book, you know, very succinctly summarizes or synthesizes the literature and what we know to be the problems, but then it very much moves on very quickly to solutions, to, you know, like strategies, conditions, approaches, policies, and other things that actually advance Black male student success. So I really wish that more teachers and school leaders and higher ed administrators and community college educators read that book, because I think that there's some very serious wisdom in it, not just from Luke and me, but also from the cast of the cast of friends and experts that we invited to author chapters. All right, so let's take one more, actually. So last one.
Okay, you got a second win there. Okay, thank you so much. I'm pulling it up. This one comes from a student in the program whose name is Terry Cybers, and he says, if you didn't have gatekeeper constraints to publishing or depending on funding from generally white institutions, would your message change?
Mm-mm. No. No. We just talked about this in my class tonight, actually. You know, I teach a course here, Race and Education. And, you know, a student was talking about code switching. And I respect people who masterfully code switch. I also understand that some people have to code switch. So no shade to code switchers. I'm not a code switcher. You know, I tell the same truth in the same way, in the same voice, whether I'm in a room with Frank and Luke and my boys, or if I'm in an all-white audience on a stage somewhere. You know, and I write in the same voice, regardless of venue. Yeah, I just, yeah, I don't know, like I just, I'm firmly committed to my truth-telling stance and approach to truth-telling. The thing about gatekeepers, they can't keep all the gates. I mean, they can keep some of them, right? So with my publications, for instance, you know, sometimes I'm too much for one journal, but I'm just right for another. So there's that, right? Like I don't give up. Book publishers like to sell books. They're in the business of selling books. So they like books that, you know, have very much a truth-telling, very much activist and controversial and all of this stuff kind of stance, because that's going to help them sell books. That's where our interests converge. They want to sell books and make money. I want to tell the truth and be helpful and make my knowledge both, you know, accessible and make my intelligence actionable. So that works out really well with book publishers and me. One last thing that I'll say is that I do think that it's important sometimes to create our own venues for message dissemination. When I directed our center at Penn, and certainly we're going to do this at USC. I mean, we just got here, but you know, we produced our own and published our own reports. there were no gatekeepers, right? Like we, very much controlled our own narrative, our own packaging, and so on. So I think that those are the ways that I both sort of skillfully dealt with, but also circumvented, any gatekeeping that I've encountered, along this now 18-year journey.
And I would add that that is a very brave thing to do, because there is risk that comes with that. And to say that, hey, I recognize that, but I still feel like it's important to be a truth teller. I think that that's important. And I just want to thank you for doing that, and for, I'm sure, all the things that might come with that, many good, but also some that are not so good. And to be the leader that you are in our field, in many ways, the big brother to all of us who do this work, that's a hard mantle to carry. And so just thank you so much for doing it, for your commitment, for being such an advocate, for your truth telling, and for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you, Shaun. Hey, thanks. I really appreciate it. And best wishes, Luke, with the rest of this very important series that you've organized. I'll be forever indebted to you for including me in it and for doing it. I think it's super important.
Okay, so just to conclude with some of the things that stood out as Shaun was talking, was just writing down, and some people were texting me things that he said that I think is just important to conclude with for this evening. So he says, when we only focus on Black boys and men who do not succeed, we don't learn anything about success, really highlighting the importance of looking at those who have been successful, looking at what it took for them to get to that point, and saying, okay, what is it in there that we can replicate to help advance success for this population? In response to the research that's been done by Ogbu and others that's talked about this notion of acting white, he said it is the achievement that has black men been accused of acting white, but blacks are happy to see others do well. And he said it's not just about whether they achieve, it's about having a better than you stance. And if we are able to basically be successful and do it in a way where we don't do that, then no, our community celebrates our success. He talked about the importance of qualitative and quantitative data, saying using qualitative and quantitative data to raise the national consciousness about inequities. He talked regularly about Black Boy Joy, that was put up here by Michelle Desjardins. He said that structures, cultures, and policy that reproduce inequity really needs to be where we focus, and that there's really just not enough work on structural deterrence of the success, which is why we haven't seen more positive outcomes for our Black boys men, despite the proliferation of research on this topic. He said that institutional leaders do not oftentimes have well-informed practices for Black men. One of the things that Frank and I see very often is what we call Brothers in Suits programs. We got this from another colleague. And basically, it's this notion that we're going to just dress our Black boys and men in suits and make them look dressed up really nice, but we're not really giving them any real meaningful interventions. We parade them around our campuses. We put them all over our flyers and brochures, and they're still not successful because the primary intervention is this notion that, well, we need to dress them up, like we dress up an animal or something, or a child. He talked about being firmly committed to truth-telling in his work, saying that, hey, I don't code switch. I recognize that some people do, but I don't. He then talked about intercollegiate athletics, saying perhaps nowhere in higher education is the disenfranchisement of Black men more insidious than in intercollegiate athletics. He said that it is wrong, it is absurd, and that he wished there had been more NFL players who had threatened not to play as opposed to threatening to kneel, and that might have produced something different. And then in contrasting the two presidential administrations, lastly, he said that Obama used his administration to show that Black boys and men matter. The current administration, in contrast, is disastrous and terrible. They've taken serious efforts to roll back policies against sexual assault. and that he's disgusted by Betsy DeVos and others for rolling back these specific policies. So I think he gave us a lot to think about. Thank you for joining us, or those who are still on the live broadcast, and we'll see you next week.